Good evening, everybody, and welcome to a special edition of Uncut History. And we have no. Oh, I guess I have to hit that button. Yeah, that was weird. I don't know why we did that. I think everybody ran away. They're like, "Oh, black screen. Okay, the stream's over. Bye, everybody." Then we just hit this.
Apparently.
No, we're not done yet. I'm gonna try to go for an hour. I'm gonna level with you. I've been writing notes and I'm like, oh, we have this 160th anniversary of this part of the Petersburg campaign. Let's talk about that. Oh, I'm whooped this week from work. I don't have time. Oh, maybe we should talk about this. This is coming up in a few weeks. Nah, I gotta devote time to college. Oh, this I probably should talk about this now. I got to get research ready for my next major blitz for retracing history videos. And then I got to today, and I'm like, it's the 160th of Lee's surrender. There ain't many more 160ths I can commemorate for the Civil War at this rate. I guess we go back to the starting line and start doing what? Would it be 164s? We can start doing 164. It's not that zingy. So I'm like, all right, I'm gonna do 160th anniversary. Surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. I am so tired. I didn't realize what I was getting into today. And then, so what this is going to become probably tonight, I don't got a slideshow. I don't got pretty pictures. You're just going to look at this ugly grill. I mean, nice uniform. I do got that going at least. You can look at the lovely background. Has nothing to do with what we're talking about tonight, but it's back there. Nice, pretty colors. Pretty people like pretty colors. Do you like pretty colors, chat? I hope you like pretty colors because I'm just going to sit here and really just wing it, talking about what I can recall off of memory, not just really about Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, but more what led up to this moment. Because you really need to understand everything that goes down in the latter half of March and the first week of April of 1865. Most historians of American history will tell you that April of 1865 was probably the single craziest month in American history. So much happens. We go from being in a state of civil war, which we had been in since the start of the decade. By the end of it, the war is over. The rebel capital's been burned. The president of the United States has been assassinated. The assassin has been hunted down and killed. There's a whole cabal that's been found out to try to take over the United States government. You have all those investigations. You have another surrender going on of Confederate forces. It is bonkers how much happens. We're only really going to talk about a small sample of it. So if you start getting winded at the end of the stream, just remember we're talking about just a small portion of the wildest month in American history. Where do we begin talking about how do we get to Appomattox Courthouse? Well, we need to talk about the situation in March of 1865. So it's been a while since we've talked about Lee and Grant. I think the last time we talked about them, we talked about them in July of 1864. Well, 2024 is when I was talking, but I was talking about the stuff that happened in 1864. I'm Editor Chan, were they aware of that? I think the chat was aware that anyways. We talked about the Battle of the Crater, and by that point, Lee and Grant have been locked in trench warfare around the vital railroad hub of Petersburg, Virginia, for about a month at that point. Well, the Union thought they had this clever idea of how they were going to end the siege abruptly and possibly bring the war to its finale. They blew a massive crater underneath the Confederate lines, but mismanagement over how the operation went, like taking the troops that you spend 3 weeks training, and then the last minute you pull them out and then put these green troops in and have no idea what they're about to do. Yeah, that totally wasn't going to end in a disaster or anything. Funny story, it ended in a spectacular disaster, and that's why everybody knows about it. And after the Battle of the Crater, Grant really does not try to go headlong at Petersburg again. You're going to still get many battles. There's going to be a lot of sparring between the two battle lines it's not just the Petersburg line. It's really the Richmond-Petersburg line. We got earthworks running from the northern outskirts of Richmond to the southeastern outskirts across the James River. Then we got them going down around the east and south side of Petersburg. And then they start extending west, like some 30 miles of earthworks are going to ultimately be dug parallel earthworks. And really, Grant's objective is to stretch Lee thin, force him to put force him to take such a wide front that he's going to have giant holes in his line, or he's not going to be able to supply, and also just wear them out, force them to chew up every ounce of supply. And the real damage isn't necessarily being done by Grant in this siege warfare. It's mainly being done by William Tecumseh Sherman and his Union Army group that's just tearing up the Deep South. You know, the infamous March through Georgia, the March to the Sea, which by early 1865 has now become the March up the Atlantic coast. So you got Sherman and his Union forces. They're in February of 1865, they're actually going to capture Columbia, South Carolina, and now they're threatening to come into North Carolina. There's a realistic possibility that these two Union Army groups can unite in Petersburg and completely overwhelm Lee. You also have going on down in the Gulf of Mexico. Oh, wait, the Gulf of America. My bad. My bad. I made the orange man upset. I will not make him upset again. You're going to have in the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah. Yeah, it's going to change in less than 4 years. Let's all be real here. So in Mobile, Alabama, there's a Union offensive being planned. I think it's going to be General Canby, if I'm not mistaken. Let me look at I did try to put notes together for tonight's stream. It just ran out of time. There just was no time for that. There was no time to make notes and be a proper historian. You're merely a nerdy history buff. You will never reach the rank of historian. We may allow you to sit at the Council of Historians, but you'll never gain the title of it. Yeah, Union General Edward Canby, he's down there preparing to try to capture Mobile, Alabama. And also just consider, in April of 1861, 11 states secede from the United States of America over fear that the Lincoln administration was going to abolish slavery and all the economic and social ramifications that would mean. The fear of it, not that he said he was going to do it. They were just so paranoid that it may happen. And we had 11 states secede. You also had Kentucky and Missouri. You had competing state governments. A lot of that was quickly kiboshed by 1862. But March of 1865, Tennessee, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Georgia, and now South Carolina have all effectively fallen. I mean, all you really got left, you got parts of Alabama, you got Florida. I mean, the Union do have a presence on the Atlantic coast of Florida, but Florida was still mainly in Confederate possession. You have Texas, but Texas is completely isolated continentally from the rest of the Confederacy. You have to send supplies on a very risky trip through the Gulf of America. But you're probably going to get hit by the blockade. You got North Carolina in the process of being conquered by Sherman, and then you have the lower half of Virginia, which has just been, at the Northern Virginia has been at the epicenter of the war since the very beginning. It's not looking good, is what I'm saying, and everybody knows it. Everybody on both sides know the situation has not gone favorably for the Confederacy. The Confederate government were really holding out hope that Lincoln was not going to be reelected. They really were putting a lot of faith in their fighting forces. And by their fighting forces, I'm not talking about General Hood. Poor Hood. Oh, poor Hood. We're talking about Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee is starting to reach levels of, I forget where the quote comes from. I think Lee at one point, when he knows how bad things are getting, he kind of asks, to his commanders, like, what will the country think if I contemplate doing this? And the response is, the country, you are the country. Lee's really the only the light in the dark for the Confederacy, as everything else is imploding around them. So the Confederate government, and primarily President Jefferson Davis, is having all of this trust on Lee. They're just overhyping Lee, and they're putting too much weight on his shoulders. Like, oh, Lee will find a way. Oh, he's always found the way to outmaneuver everybody. And this is not the Army of Northern Virginia we know about in the autumn of 1862, running roughshod through Northern Virginia and into Maryland. This is a very weak Army of North Virginia. Lee and the Army of North Virginia have been stuck in the same location for almost a year now. Lee's reporting to newly appointed Secretary of War, John C. Breckinridge. He's talking about his men have not had meat rations and free days. And this is in February of 1865. It's only going to get worse as Sherman gets closer and closer through North Carolina to Petersburg, Virginia. So that's the situation. The Confederate government is putting way too much trust in Lee, and even Lee knows it. And eventually, what's going to happen is in March, you're going to have this meeting occur involving Grant. It's going to involve President Lincoln. There are going to be a few other important figures. I believe like the gentleman in charge of the U.S. Navy is there. They're all there. All the head figures involved in this war are there. And basically, Lincoln hashes out, I've been reelected. And that's another thing to mention. In 1864, the other big hope the Confederacy had, they thought that if we can bleed the Union armies enough, make the Union population so sick of this war, they'll vote for somebody like George B. McClellan, and then we can have peace negotiations. It may not be perfect, but we may enter some truce where we can keep some independence and we don't have to go back in the Union. Well, Lincoln ends up getting reelected, and that is completely out the window. So this is a second term. Lincoln really could do carte blanche on how he wants to handle the war. And the idea is I want the war to be over as quickly as possible. But once the war has been brought to its end, we can't do what we may have done a few years ago. I've always wondered if the war had ended, like maybe it was only a year-long war. I've always wondered, would the Confederate soldiers, and especially Confederate officers and Confederate politicians, would they have been tried for treason? Would they had been executions for treachery? It's interesting to think, but so far in the war now, there's been so much bloodshed and everybody is so sick of it at this point that Lincoln's idea is he basically entrusts Grant to find the quickest but bloodless way to end this. That means you have to shed some blood to force him to surrender, fine, but once the peace is made, it's peace. We're one country again. So, on March 24th, 1865, Grant is going to issue orders of what will become known as his 9th offensive against Petersburg. Yes, the 9th offensive. I call Petersburg a siege. It is a campaign. The troops are moving back and forth. It's not like the Great War. I think we do, a lot of people usually say, Petersburg's the birth of trench warfare. And this is exactly what the Great War was like. And there is some truth to that. It is like, hey, this is a precursor to what we're going to see a number of decades later in Europe. And there are a lot of similarities in the fortifications and how they're supplying troops. I mean, did you know they had a military railroad? The Union built a military railroad just to go behind their earthworks to feed all their troops that were surrounding Petersburg. I'm totally not going to make a video about that someday. Now, Reed out making videos about trains in the Civil War. Nah, he would never make a train video. But on the other hand, it's not just that they're stuck there. They are trying to move. They're trying to extend the lines. It's not like they're in complete gridlock. And his 9th offensive on Petersburg is going to look a little bit like this. He essentially going to have the 5th and I got to double check 5th and 24th, right? Yeah. There's a lot of Army Corps when you deal with 1865. Like the Union armies have just gotten way out of hand with how many corps they have. They keep enlisting and keep conscripting soldiers. It's like more. Wait, I'm thinking, what number do we hit? I think we hit 25. I did a live stream actually where we ranked the Corps badge insignia. I should know how many Union Army Corps were. I'm tired. I'm tired from work. My brain no do good. I need more banquet. Wait a minute. Alcohol's not good for the brain. So yes, it's my apologies. It's the 5th and 2nd Union Army Corps, along with Philip Sheridan's Union Cavalry Corps. They're going to move behind Union western flank. They're going to kind of move to the southwest, and via Dinwiddie Courthouse, they're going to get onto the Ford Road, and essentially they're going to try to outflank the Army of North Virginia. And part of the reason the war has happened, they've been fighting for so long around Petersburg, are the rail lines that come in and out of Petersburg. By March of 1865, there's only one rail line that's still in the possession of the Confederates, and that's the South Side Railroad. This is the only major supply artery Lee has at his disposal, as well in some ways as Richmond has as well, for the people of Richmond. So Grant is setting his sights on cutting off the South Side Railroad to the west of Petersburg, and that's going to force Lee to do something. Lee's either going to have to break out and get slaughtered or sue for peace right then and there. So that is the rough idea of the 9th Union Offensive, which is planned on March 24th, 1865. It'll get modified. If you're watching the replay, I'm sure you're going to comment, well, actually, that's not how it works. Yeah, I know that's not how it quite worked, but that was the plan. That was the general plan. Coincidentally, at the same time, maybe not exactly the same hour, but around the same rough time frame, Lee is having his own discussions with his officer, trying to figure out, what do I do? Now, normally in a situation, he would go to somebody like James Longstreet, his old warhorse. But Longstreet is actually on a visit to Richmond at this point. So he's going to turn to the commander of the 2nd Corps in the Army of North Virginia, and that is John B. Gordon. Once you've been a long follower of the channel, you have heard his name one too many times, I'm sure. Look, the man writes really well. I can't help it. I know his stuff is romanticized, and I know he did not so good things in his life after the American Civil War that we're not going to get into that tonight, and I don't condone them, but come on, the man writes good history. The guy just writes good romance, so soldier romance. No, not that soldier romance. So John B. Gordon has made his way from the ranks from being the colonel of the 6th Alabama, got shot 5 times at Antietam, and now he finds himself in one of the highest positions of command in the Army of North Virginia. So man really went from, I want to say rags from riches, but he went from one tier of richness to another tier of richness. But this is Confederate richness. So technically, the higher you go up in rank, the more the war goes on, the more your currency deflates, devalues. Yeah, you know how that works. And he asks Gordon, what do you suggest I do? And Gordon will suggest him 3 options. The first is, my brain fried for a moment. John B. Gordon gives Lee 3 options. You make a surprise attack that's going to force Grant to constrict his battle lines because he doesn't know what Lee is up to, and that'll allow Lee to maneuver out of the earthworks and try to gain an advantageous position against the Union. If that doesn't work, you probably should abandon Petersburg and Richmond and try to link up with Joe Johnston's Army of Tennessee. No, it's not Hood's Tennessee. It's not the fun Army of Tennessee I love talking about so much. It's the Army of Tennessee in 1865 is like Journey without Steve Perry, okay? So Joe Johnston's down there with the newly reformed Army of Tennessee. And the idea is like, if we could link up with him, we can just bring all of our numbers to bear, and then we'll fight him like Napoleon wanted to fight the coalition in 1815. Because that went well for Napoleon. How much do I have to stress? It is a very bad situation Robert E. Lee is in at this point. And then if that doesn't work, you can't link up with Johnston, make the best terms with the enemy. So that's what Gordon advises Lee. And then Lee's like, okay, do you have an idea for an offensive? Because I got none. And Gordon actually does. About southeast of the city of Pittsburgh. No, the city of Petersburg, which they call it cities. Bit of a stretch, even by today's standards. So to the southeast of Petersburg, where the 2 battle lines are, there is an area where the battle lines are barely 100 yards apart. In fact, the enemy pickets are only 50 yards apart. They're like talking to each other every day. They're sending stuff back and forth. It's just kind of like, get a surrender? No. Got tobacco? Yeah. Want to give it to me? No. Why? I got nothing else. I've entered a state where I run on tobacco, good Virginia tobacco. They won't give us anything else. So there's this spot where the 2 lines are very close, and on the Union side is Fort Stedman. On the Confederate side is Colquitt Salient. And Gordon's idea is, in pre-dawn hours, we're going to launch an attack. We're going to, I'm going to get as many men of my corps together. We're going to put them in a nice wedge formation. I'm going to send out axemen to cut through the chevaux de frise that's in no man's land, these sharp spikes that make it hard for lines of soldiers to advance. We're going to cut them down. And then we'll just basically open a road for my men to charge right into Fort Stedman, take its guns. And then the other cool thing is about Fort Stedman, it is not far from the military railroad that I mentioned about earlier that's coming down around the back of the Union entrenchments. So he's hoping we can cause destruction to parts of the military railroad. We can break out, going north and south up the trench line. We can maybe threaten City Point, which is, of course, Grant's headquarters at this point, and a lot of the supplies for the Union are coming in for the siege of Petersburg. At best case scenario, best case scenario, we do temporary destruction to the Union supply chain that forces them to constrict their lines. Ideally, we might be able to turn their flank here. That could happen. Worst case scenario, we all die. And now we have a giant gap in our line that Grant may exploit. So it's a dangerous plan that Gordon has going. But Lee has no other options. He approves it. And in the early morning hours of March 25th, 1865, Gordon is going to lead about 10,000 Confederate soldiers across no man's land. They wash over Fort Stedman. They capture it pretty quickly. I mean, there were very little gunshots fired actually in the initial attack. They surprised the Union pickets, surprised the Union garrison in Fort Stedman. They capture about 500 Union prisoners. They're even going to capture basically the main Union commander in the vicinity there. His name was, small world, Brigadier General Napoleon B. McLaughlin. He's going to end up becoming a prisoner of war. And he ended up taking about 500 yards of earthworks on either side of Fort Stedman. But miscommunication by the guides who were meant to locate the batteries to the east of Fort Stedman, well, they get lost in the dark. They don't know where to go. They're in enemy trenches. I don't know what the heck. I don't even know how do you become a guide of an enemy earthwork? How do you do that? Like you would have to be like somebody who either what you're doing, like maybe you're a traitor, maybe you're somebody who you deserted or something and joined the. Who would want to desert the Union Army in 1865, especially around Petersburg? So yeah, these highly qualified guides that Gordon got. So once they get Fort Stedman, that's kind of where the Confederate offensive ends. At the time, I should mention that they punctured the Union line in the vicinity of the Union 9th Corps. And are we familiar with the Union 9th Corps? Because that was the corps tasked with taking the Confederate breach that was made by the Crater back in July of 1864. And that was General Burnside's last battle. He ain't around this time. No, we have a gentleman by the name of John Parke. John Parke is classic West Point material. He doesn't flinch here and that. The Confederates have overrun Fort Stedman. He just kind of looks at it like, send in Hartstiff. So he is going to rally Wilcox's division, and then he's going to send for Brigadier General Hartramp's division. And Hartramp is in charge of mostly inexperienced soldiers. A lot of them are Pennsylvanians. I actually will be talking tomorrow about one of the men that was in this division from the 211th Pennsylvania. That's John C. Ewing. Not tomorrow, Friday. I'm so used to streaming on Thursdays. It's a Wednesday. Friday, we'll be talking about a member of the 211th who actually took part in this battle, John C. Ewing. And though these guys have never been really in a major battle before, they perform admirably. Some describe them being just like veterans. It's like we didn't know that they were newer soldiers. They come in, pour heavy volleys on Gordon's corps. They're going to push Gordon's men back through Fort Stedman. And then you get this appalling situation where terrible rain, it's March, and no man's land's nothing but mud. So as Gordon's men are trying to fall back to the west, so they're trying to fall back to their trenches, they have to go for no man's land. Their feet are getting stuck in the mud, and they're easy targets for Hartramp's division, Wilcox's division. They're just taking pot shots until ceasefire's called. It's a terrible scene. And I've heard a couple Confederate recounts by Confederate soldiers. I've read basically where they say, we had all this energy going into the attack on Fort Stedman. And the moment we got to the top and we just saw all these divisions coming in, we knew we were done. At that point, it's like, we just don't have that much manpower. I was trying to find the actual, the numbers of what the Army of North Virginia has by this point. I think I could be wrong. It's around 50 to 55,000. I've heard some say it was up to 65,000. I don't believe that. I think it was more about 50,000. So keep the number in the back of your head. It's going to come back here before the stream's over. And if you are watching live, consider popping in the chat. If you have any questions, I don't know if tonight's a good night to ask, but you may get an interesting response. If you comment on the replay on Readout Productions replay, I'd be happy to answer your questions. I'll have more time to research it. I'd be happy to answer questions, more in-depth questions then. So, Battle Fort Stedman, Confederate disaster, does not work. Little do they know that'd be the last time the Army of North Virginia would ever try to go on the offensive again. And really, this does not change Grant's plans for his knife offensive. It does cause him to make some tweaks, but other than that, really doesn't do much. And he goes forward around March 29th with his ninth offensive. And of course, we have the 5th, 2nd Corps and Sheridan's Cavalry Corps. They're moving via Dinwiddie Courthouse. Now, Lee does, he's getting reports from his cavalry, which is commanded by relative of his, Fitzhugh Lee. He's sending back reports, hey, this large Union force is looking to threaten our right flank. So Lee is going to end up detaching the division of George Pickett. And yes, that George Pickett. He's going to send George Pickett. And really, the lines are not connecting. I mean, he's literally detaching. He's sending Pickett along with Fitzhugh Lee, and he's sending some other Confederate forces. And they're breaking from the Petersburg line to go several miles to the west of the Confederate earthworks, and really to guard 5 Forks. There will be skirmishing around Dinwiddie Courthouse. There's going to be skirmishing on the White Oak Plank Road. There's going to be all that stuff happening. But really, the next big battle is 5 Forks. April 1st, 1865. Initially, the day before, because of the heavy rains that were bogging down the Union forces, Grant was going to call off his 9th offensive, which is crazy to think about. I mean, history would have been very different if he had not done that. Phil Sheridan was he's so full of energy at this point. He's tasting victory. He's like, I know the Confederates are beaten. I know they're whipped. And he hears Grant say, yeah, I want you to recall. Sheridan rides the whole way back to his headquarters. It's just like, I am not turning back. No more turning back. I'm done. This is win or I'm dying situation. And Grant's like, okay, you go ahead. If you have that much energy, I will not stop you. Now, Phil Sheridan, before he left that day, was also upset. He also mentioned to Grant he was not too satisfied that he had to work with the Union 5th Army Corps. And the reason for that is, let's wind the clocks back to our Spotsylvania courthouse stream. Back in 1864, when Phil Sheridan's cavalry was trying to move out of the wilderness to try to cut off Lee from retreating and fortifying around Spotsylvania Courthouse, Sheridan thought he could get around Lee's rear and kind of trap him. Well, that night's quick movements were blocked on the road because Governor K. Warren's men had they decided to bivouac in the middle of the road. The reason being they couldn't go and bivouac that night in the forest because the forest was on fire. The wilderness was literally catching a flame from the battle that just happened. But Sheridan was furious with Governor K. Warren for having his men bivouac right in the way. It delayed Sheridan's cavalry, and Sheridan blamed Warren then for Lee being able to build his trenches around Spotsylvania. And Spotsylvania Courthouse, by the way, became the 3rd bloodiest battle of the American Civil War. So there was that bone to pick. There's a lot of other bones to pick. We mentioned last year as we talked about the Overland Campaign, Governor K. Warren became this hero for the Union Army at the Battle of Gettysburg because he spotted the strategic importance of Little Round Top. But that's when he was working for he was the chief of engineers for the Army of the Potomac. Then they decided to put the guy in charge of the engineers in charge of infantry, and it didn't go too well. And by 1865, there's been so many false starts by the Union 5th Corps in battles. Warren's chief of artillery, he actually writes he wonders if Warren has a screw loose. There's a lot of people today who say that Warren was exhibiting symptoms of manic depression, which is very possible, especially considering how much he had been through and had seen in the war. And back then, they didn't really got what that was, and it just made Sheridan all the more angry whenever Warren was having a bad day. And here we have on April 1st, nothing really happens in the morning. Warren is taking his time trying to organize the Fifth Corps to get him in the right position because he's been instructed by Sheridan to get behind the right flank, try to outflank Pickett from his left. It's not until after 4 o'clock on April 1st that the attack begins. And Sheridan's preoccupied on the Confederate right. He's pressing his cavalry like George Armstrong's Custer. Yeah, he's there, trying to press against the Confederate right. And what ends up happening is Warren finds that it's hard to see where Pickett's left flank is around Five Forks. It's heavily forested, this intersection. It's called Five Forks. It's literally a 5-point intersection. And if you control this intersection, you have access to that Ford Road that goes right to the South Side Railroad. And if you take the South Side Railroad, you cut off the Confederate Army in Petersburg. So what ends up happening is Warren's Fifth Corps ends up, they hit the right flank. It is far more fierce than they anticipated. They miscalculated where Pickett had left his left flank. I keep saying right flank. I'm sorry. It's the left flank that Warren and the Fifth Corps are attacking. So Warren realizes, oh goodness, my one division is going too far this way. Mine's going too far that way. He starts riding between the divisions, trying to pull them back to be in their battle formations. Well, Sheridan gets wind that Warren is not at the front. No doubt he's not at the front because he's running back and forth between the divisions. Sheridan didn't hear about what Warren was trying to do. All he heard was Warren was missing from the front. Doesn't seem like the Fifth Corps has a commander. They're spread out all over the place. Grant had given Sheridan permission the night before to relieve Warren if he deemed the situation necessary, which I was just recently rewatching the American Battlefield Trust videos relating to the Battle of Five Forks. Chris White actually said, and I'm going to reuse Chris White's quote in that video, Grant giving Sheridan permission to relieve Warren is like giving somebody the nuclear keys. He's going to use it. Why would you do it? And guess what he did? Sheridan, in the middle of the Battle of Five Forks, in the middle of Warren trying to do his job of reorganizing the Fifth Corps so they'll be more effective in battle, relieves him of command. And honestly, it is worth a video onto itself. The inquiries, the investigations of the Battle of Five Forks that'll happen in the decades afterwards to vindicate Warren's name. The short answer is Warren will be found not at fault for what he did at Five Forks, but by the time they decide he was not guilty, it was the 1880s and Warren was dead. Unfortunately, there was a lot of just bad stuff that had happened to Warren throughout the war that there was just too much negative stuff. So one small move was just enough to set Sheridan off and end Warren's military career. Well, I shouldn't say end it. He stayed in the military the rest of his life. It just never stuck well with him. He was dismissed of command in the middle of battle. That always stuck with him. But the good news is, when Sheridan attacked on April 1st, there were no real leaders on the battlefield beyond your brigade level. There were no real superior commanders on the battlefield. Where is George Pickett during the Battle of Five Forks? He's at a shad bake. Look, the government may be imploding. Our country may be over in the matter of hours, but it doesn't stop tradition. We're going to go have our good old-fashioned Virginia shad bake. So that's where Pickett and Lee were during the Battle of Five Forks, and by the time they learned what was happening, it was well too late. Due to lack of leadership and just due to overwhelming numbers, Sheridan and the Fifth Corps, they just destroyed Pickett's division. Oh no, Pickett's division destroyed. I've never heard of that one before. It wasn't even really Pickett's division. He kind of had 3 of his brigades, and the other brigades were from other divisions. They'd been pulled over and given to him for this assignment. I mean, we all know what happened to his initial division. So the Battle of Five Forks, a decisive Union victory. The Union break through, take the intersection, and march toward the South Side Railroad. Lee is cut off and surrounded. No sooner as actually, this is kind of happening at the same time. We have the Battle of Five Forks in the evening of April 1st. We're going into the night of April 1st, the morning of April 2nd. We got Grant fully mobilizing his army. He is ready to make the big final attack on Petersburg. He was just waiting for Five Forks to fall. Now that he has Lee surrounded, he's going in right now for the kill. He's not allowing Lee to pull back in and constrict his lines. He's going right now. And in the early light of April 2nd, the third battle of Petersburg erupts. And really, it's going to come down to the Sixth Corps and the Ninth Corps. The Ninth Corps are more to the eastern side of the city. They try to break through at a place known as Fort Mahones, later named Fort Damnation by the soldiers. Yes, fair. I'd love to go to Fort Damnation. And yeah, actually, it earns its title pretty well. It is a rough position to break through. And actually, the Ninth Corps initially stuck. They do not break through Fort Damnation on the morning of April 2nd. But the Sixth Corps, yes, the Union Sixth Corps. I think over the years of doing these live streams, the Union Sixth Corps become my favorite infantry corps in the Union Army. Just they are the how would I word them? They are your special forces by 1865. If there is a new innovative idea you want to test, give it to the Sixth Corps. Oh, you're telling me Jubal Early is trying to attack Washington, D.C. We're hundreds of miles away from us. Send the Sixth Corps to stop him. The Sixth Corps is always the clutch saver for the Union Army in 1864 and into 1865. And they showed their brilliance earlier. So it's fitting that it's the Union Sixth Corps. They're going to advance around an area known as Arthur Swamp, which is to the south of Petersburg. And they're in that wedge formation that they experimented with. They used the wedge formations to break through Confederate battle lines at the Second Battle of Fredericksburg in 1863. They tested this formation to try to break through the Mule Shoe at Spotsylvania Courthouse. And here it is in 1865. Their wedge formation breaks through the Confederate earthworks at Petersburg, April 2nd, 1865. Man, it ticks me off that this is not the battle that people think of. We always talk about the battles in the Civil War to come to mind. We always hear Antietam and Gettysburg and Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, and that's rightfully so. But you're talking about what are some of the most important battles in the Civil War that the whole conflict changes on a dime. This is one of them. After since June of 1864. These two armies have been essentially stuck in the same place. It all ends when Horatio Wright's Sixth Corps breaks through Confederate earthworks and open the floodgates. Around the same time that this breakthrough happens, Lee is a few miles away at his headquarters at a place known as Edge Hill. And he's actually suffering from rheumatism at this time. So he's actually confined to a bed. And he's talking with Longstreet about, they've just received word about what's happened to Five Forks. So think about that. Lee is just this morning waking up and getting reports that, Pickett's division has been knocked back. We've lost the South Side Railroad. We're trapped in Petersburg. And then no sooner that he has to think, okay, what am I going to do now? Then there's somebody coming into his headquarters and saying the Union have just broken through our line a few miles away. A.P. Hill, who's, of course, one of the Corps commanders for the Army of North Virginia, he's in the headquarters at the time. He is going to mount a horse and ride to the front to try to rally these soldiers. And then we get another story that I've talked about before here on the channel, and that ain't going to stop me from talking about it again. No sooner than Hill rides out and gets close to the area of Arthur Swamp. He's going for the force. I mean, everything's chaos at this point. You have Confederate soldiers, just individual clusters of soldiers running this way, running that way. There's no cohesion anymore. Hill in the woods is going to come across two Union soldiers. One of them is a gentleman by John Mock. If I can double check, that's correct. I know his last name is Mock. It's a really Pennsylvania name, Mock. Of course, that's why I know the story. Pennsylvania stories. I'm going to talk about my Pennsylvania stories. It's John W. Mock of the 138th Pennsylvania. he and his friend, they kind of got lost from the Sixth Corps and they're going through the woods, like, where's everybody else at? Everybody got so excited from the breakthrough. And then here he comes with what he bumps into one of the highest ranking Confederate generals, try to rally his men. And then Hill has the audacity, after you have this brief moment, guys just staring at each other, throw down your arms and surrender. And Mock kind of I just imagine this image. He kind of looks at his friend, raises musket, fires. A.P. Hill is dead. And thus begins the saga of A.P. Hill's body. Whole video about that. It is a wild story. And I'm hoping one day, actually, because John, the reason I always love telling the A.P. Hill story, John Mock is somebody that's from my he's somebody from the region I grew up in, the Pennsylvania's Laurel Highlands. And I am planning to do a retrace in history or a Laurel Highlands heroes about John Mock. So I know where his grave is. I've not actually been to it, but I know the cemetery it's at. So, but it's like about an hour drive to do it. And it's in Bedford County, Pennsylvania. And if I'm in Bedford, there's a lot of cool stuff to do in Bedford. I mean, I'd love to go. I've always said I want to do like a video on the Jean Benet taverns, this old like stone tavern's been around since the late 18th century. Civil War soldiers dying there. I could tie that all in. Maybe John Mock dying there. He died there and he knew one day he was going to kill A.P. Hill. He knew it. April 2nd, breakthrough Petersburg. It is complete chaos in Confederate ranks. The sixth, I should say it wasn't just these two corps. The whole army is participating in some capacity. And the 24th Corps, they're on the flank of the 6th Corps. They're involved in this attack. The 24th Corps are going to kind of leapfrog in front of the 6th Corps because the 6th Corps start losing steam. They've been fighting. I mean, they've been going all night, moving around. Now they're fighting for the morning, for the afternoon of April 2nd. The 24th Corps picked up where they left off. And they're going to end up going to... they're going to end up... I can't speak. My brain. Yeah, my brain just froze. Sorry, guys. Like I said, I'm pretty tired. I should not have been doing the stream today, but I couldn't avoid this day. I had to talk about what we're leading to today. They get to the Boyden Plank Road. They're stalled by two small Confederate forts known as Gregg and Whitworth. They're kind of like the Alamo for the Confederacy. There's about 300 Confederate soldiers occupying the two forts. They're going to inflict 700 casualties on the 24th Corps before this day's over and on other Union forces. All 300 defenders become casualties of war, killed, wounded, or captured. It did buy time for the rest of the Army of North Virginia, especially Lee, to figure out what his plan was. And let's go back to what John B. Gordon had advised Lee to do a few days ago. Try for an offensive. If that doesn't work, we got to leave Petersburg and Richmond. So that's his next plan. Around the afternoon of April 2nd, Lee is going to write to the Secretary of War, John C. Breckinridge, and advises him to notify President Davis to evacuate Richmond. We can no longer defend Richmond. And boy, do we enter probably one of the most controversial parts of the American Civil War. It's say to lie, like you say this about everything. Look, April 1865 is wild. So much is happening. So, in Richmond, the military commander of Richmond was a guy by the name of Richard Ewell, which you'll probably remember. You probably recognize his name if you've learned about any Civil War battle. Richard Ewell really has a skeleton crew to maintain order in Richmond. So, yeah, imagine you have your president declaring to you, after, months of, you hear this battle. I mean, keep in mind, Richmond has been in they've kind of just gotten accustomed to being under attack. I mean, you had the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, which got very close. Union forces got really close in 1862 to capture Richmond, but were thwarted when Robert E. Lee took charge of the Army of North Virginia. And then ever since 1864, they've been under a quasi siege. They hear artillery fire every day echoing all over the place. So people just got used to being under the threat of guns, enemy guns. And it was one of them, oh, well, this has been going on for years now. They're never going to actually break into Richmond. They're never actually going to take the capital. Lee's going to stop them. And all of that, false insecurity completely collapses when, Ewell has to, when, Breckinridge and then I guess to Davis and then Davis down to Ewell announces, so we have to leave now, like drop everything. So this is just a few of the things that was going to happen to poor old Richard Ewell. Ewell's entrusted with the evacuation of the Confederate capital. He is going to try to destroy the alcohol to avoid enemy soldiers from drinking it. There were rumors that the reason Columbia, South Carolina had been burned was because Sherman had let the Union soldiers drink all this alcohol and let that go to their heads, and that's why the city was burned. Well, that led to soldiers and civilians literally going down the streets. And what Ewell's men would do, they're throwing all this alcohol out, letting it break on the brick streets. Well, then you have men out there going out there trying to drink the alcohol in the gutters because they're just like, it's the end days, it's the end times. What's going to happen to us? We're going to be considered traitors. They're going to hang us. So they're down on the ground drinking alcohol. So that didn't go well. Now you have mass drunkenness throughout the city. You don't want drunkenness in a large crowd because that leads to panic. And then you're going to have the efforts to set tobacco stores, again, we're Virginians. That's our most valuable thing, not the currency, the tobacco. Ewell's going to be instructed to destroy tobacco stores lest they fall into the hands of the enemy. And seriously, there's a lot of value there in the tobacco. Tobacco is in a way, we call it a cash crop. Well, that is money sitting there. It does have more value than the Confederate currency at the moment. So you don't want all that to be given to the enemy because they're going to end up with a lot of moolah. So they try to set that to the torch. And what they try to do is they try to take it to like a certain set of buildings that they hope are far enough from residential areas that it won't set the whole city on fire. Funny story. It ended up setting the whole city on fire. So now... Hello, Outright History. Yes, you have joined in. We are talking about the fall right now, about the whole, how we're going to we put those tobacco stores in a certain location so it wouldn't catch the city on fire. Well, it turns out it caught the city on fire. So now you have that going on. So now you got these people who are under the influence, who are in a burning city, and then they discover that at this moment, the Confederate government's like, we got to get all these food stores. We got to get all that food stuff. We got to get on rails on cars. We got to send it to Danville, which is going to be the new capital. We got to send it to Davis's home. We got to send it to, the Secretary of War's home. We got to send it to all the politicians' home. We got to send it to the Army of Northern Virginia home. These drunken, panic-stricken civilians and soldiers go, wait a minute. We had all these food stores in Richmond the whole time, and now we're in a riot state. Yeah, the fall of Richmond, and I'm sure I'm being too hyperbolic on certain things. The fall of Richmond is one of the darkest moments of the American Civil War. It just, everything goes absolutely out of hand. The city is on, we go from a controlled evacuation to the city is burned by its own, the people meant to defend it. And not in a strategic burn way either. It was chaos. We always have people going on about how Sherman, he's, going through all of, Georgia and, he's somehow northern and southern, eastern, western Georgia, all at the same time burning every farm, just laying waste to it, even though his line is perfectly straight for the heart of Georgia. That, that's strategic burning. That, we are targeting these buildings, which have military value, put it to the torch. Richmond burning was a very different situation. It was chaos. It was horrible. Everybody's losing their livelihoods. People died. I don't know how many, but I know there's casualties as a result just from the fires and everything. It's a mess. And Wrangler has joined in for 420. Confederates that placed the landmines outside of Richmond forgot to take away the flags and marks where the mines were. Oh God, I did not even know about that. Yeah, it was a mess. Oh. And one more little detail, the Confederate government and people like Jefferson Davis had put so much hope into Lee. They put too much on his shoulders that he would never be able to actually live up to those expectations. So when the news comes that Lee is having to evacuate Petersburg and he advises Davis to do the same in Richmond, Davis is supposed to catch an 8:00 train to leave Danville. He stays until 11 p.m. because he's in denial. He's like, no. He's gonna pull something out of his ass at this point, right? He always does. And then he finally boards the train at 11. Asher Burnett, what are landmines in the Civil War? Uh, ask ask outright. I mean, I wanna say yes, but it's one of them like, yes, but on the way we're accustomed to a landmine situation, but I can't also think of a example off the top of my head. I'll read history and Asher Burnett. You 2 discuss it below. My brain's too fried to go into that. So, we get to the morning of April 3rd. Petersburg's been evacuated. Richmond, it's like 56 blocks have been destroyed by fire in Richmond. It is horrible. Union forces will move into the former Confederate capital around 8 a.m. and immediately go into firefighting. Like that's what they start doing. It's a mess. And if you've watched the movie Lincoln, uh, probably the part I most greatly appreciate about the movie, it does show Lincoln visiting Petersburg and Richmond. You know, it shows him going to the front, and he's there very quickly. I mean, the breakthrough's April 2nd. Union soldiers occupy Richmond April 3rd. Lincoln's in City Point by the end of April 3rd. He's in Richmond April 4th. So he's seeing all of this destruction. He's going to see destruction around Fort Mahone's, Fort Damnation. And that's actually the part you see in the movie. It's his visit there. There's stories that when he goes into Richmond, he's sworn by a crowd mainly of people of African descent, claiming him as like basically a liberator. And he's trying to like basically push back all the admirations. He's just trying to be pretty plain and pretty down low about it. Now, which book? You know, Gabriel Reigns. Oh, here we are. According to the Google, Dr. Google, the American Civil War saw the first widespread use of landmines, specifically by the Confederacy, who developed and deployed, victim activated, and command detonated. Break. Due to chat limit. Devices, including those designed by General Gabriel J. Reigns. So yeah, you have that, and then also on April 4th, Lincoln is going to meet um, with Grant in Petersburg, and basically kind of say what they already been saying for a while. It's like when we reach the point where we finally force Lee to surrender, there should be no ill will. I've seen too much destruction. Just let it end and let everybody go back home. That's kind of I'm really taking a very important meeting, just breaking it down to a very very one phrase like just let there be peace, let it be ending. And that actually would be April 4th would be the last day Grant and Lincoln saw each other alive. And Lincoln would, of course, go back to Washington, D.C., and nothing bad would ever happen at them. Oh, Bill O'Reilly. Oh, I got like a whole collection of Bill O'Reilly books that I've received as like gifts over the years. I've never read a Bill O'Reilly book, and I'm very scared to, mostly because of the shock media way they kind of build up the books. It's like killing blank, the true story of blah blah blah. And you have all these like, really shocking imagery and stuff. It's just like, oh, what's happening? And it's just like, not everything has to be a conspiracy, guys. I need that in the clip section. I need from the Abyss. They ask Kippy like, don't you what why do you think everything is a conspiracy? Well, everything is. So I don't know. I want to read Bill Riley. I'm sure the actual text is good, but I don't know. I don't like the way because I think like doesn't like Fox Media like they're big funders of those books. Oh yeah, because the Legends and Lies is all it was done by Fox. It's actually I don't mind Legend and Lies. I actually think it's one of the better. It's one at least the original Legends and Lies was one like the better like his docudramas for historical events that was done. Although the production quality ranges from good to really bad sometimes. There's some really good production quality and some. I think what they do first. They did Civil War first, and then like the Rev War, it's a little more iffier. But like I always thought their presentations were pretty good, but maybe a little too shock media. And well, let's get to what you came for an hour into the stream. The Appomattox campaign. Woo! like I said, to understand what is going to happen on April 9th, 1865, you must understand how we get there. How does Lee get on the run? What made him finally leave the earthworks? And that's what happened. So, before Jefferson Davis, abandoned Richmond, he kind of gave Lee, he basically is like, stop at the next train station for stores. So, Lee is going to move the army north Virginia. And initially, everybody's actually pretty high in morale considering what just happened. You think the army is like emotionally devastated and they're shooken up, but like Lee's like, finally, I get to go on the offensive again. I can move. I haven't moved in 10 months. This is great. But very quickly, it's like, if you have somebody who's, it's like trying to move like a car or something that's been stuck for like 40 years. It's like, oh, that's gonna be fun. Oh God, all this noise is like, oh, this is terrible. That's the Army of North Virginia when it starts moving on April 2nd into April 3rd. It's like, yeah, we're moving. Oh God, the pains, the muscles. Oh God, we're not used to walking. We are so we need food badly. So the first objective is on April 3rd, Army North Virginia. They want to get to their end goal is to get to Danville, Virginia eventually, but their immediate goal is to get to Amelia Courthouse, where they've been promised by the Confederate government there's going to be trains of food stuff that they can procure that had been rushed out of Richmond right before everything kind of hit the fan. That's kind of what they're promised. So they limp their way out. They hurry their way out of Petersburg. They get to Amelia Courthouse. They're there by April 4th. They open up the trains. Nothing. No food stuff. So Lee has to actually send out wagons, and really, he has to send out the army to go get wagons, and then they have to use those wagons to go to other places to see if people would give up their food. And of course, this is all trying to be exchanged with Confederate currency, which is worthless at this point. So he doesn't get much food. And this whole day delay allows Grant plenty of time to move his army group out of the trenches of Petersburg and quickly start moving west toward Amelia Courthouse. Lee realizes he needs to move very quickly. So by April 5th, Lee decides to resume his advance to Danville. But unfortunately, already by April 5th, elements of Grant's Union forces, they've cut off the road leading out of Amelia Courthouse down, eventually going all the way to Southern Virginia. So Lee pivots. He decides, okay, I'm not going to Danville yet. I'm actually going to keep going west. And if I can get across the Appomattox River, which, by the way, actually eventually empties, it meets with the James and empties out around Petersburg. If I can get across the rain-swollen and Appomattox River, that's a good natural barrier that's going to take Grant some time to get across. If I can hurry across that, then I have some time maybe to go scour the countryside for more food. That's the plan. So the Army of North Virginia, they're trying to move down to the west. On April 6th, however, they're trying to cross Sailor's Creek, which again, rain swollen. Not fun trying to move across a flooded creek or river. So at Sailor's Creek, you're going to have a portion of the Army of North Virginia stuck on the wrong side of the creek. And right around that time, you're going to have about like 20 pieces of Union artillery roll up on the high ground overlooking the crossings. You're going to have the Union 6 Corps. You're going to have other elements of these Union armies pour over the hillsides, and they start attacking the rear guard of the Army of North Virginia. And the Army of North Virginia tries their darnest to hold out. They don't have the energy. The Battle of Sailor's Creek is often considered the last major battle for the Army of North Virginia. There will be more fighting afterwards. We will talk about that, but like large army group, army formations moving around the battlefield. This is really the end of that. It's a running battle. There is no fixed battle lines. It's just mobs going back and forth. Just give you an idea about the Battle of Sailor's Creek, how destructive it is to the Army of North Virginia. There's about 8,000 Confederate casualties in the Battle of Sailor's Creek. Most of that is actually captured. I mean, there's killed and wounded as well. Amongst the captured is Lieutenant General Richard Ewell. He's captured, which is just, that's incredible. And at one point, Ewell is panic stricken. And he's like, he thinks he's going to get executed. He actually thinks he's going to be executed for the burning of Richmond, that he's to blame, and that the Union Army will find some court martial to blame him with. So he's frantic. And he kind of lets slip the idea that maybe, I don't know what he exactly says, but it's basically along the lines of, I don't want to die. Lee's about to surrender. There's no sense to kill me now. And Grant's like, Lee's going to surrender? So that's the Battle of Sailor's Creek. Also worth mentioning, April 6, 1865 alone sees over 50 Congressional Medal of Honors awarded for action on that date. A lot of that's captured flags, but still, just it's crazy. Nobody really talks about it. Nobody talks about this stuff. I'd love to go see Sailor's Creek. It is one of my bucket list. I'd love to go see the Sailor's Creek battlefield. Got all these Medal of Honor recipients from this one engagement. Now, just a few miles away, as the Battle of Sailor's Creek is occurring, you're also going to have a fight around what is known as High Bridge, which, well, it's as it describes. It's a high bridge. So I want you to have you watched the episode of Retracing History about the Kinzu Bridge? Once the world's tallest railroad bridge. Okay, I want you to picture that, but they're fighting on top of it, like cavalry fighting back and forth. That's the Battle of High Bridge. It goes for April 6th into April 7th. This is a railroad bridge over the Appomattox River. So this is one of the vital arteries for Lee to get the Army of North Virginia out of Grant's grasp. The hope is get the army over and then burn it. And actually, Confederate cavalry do succeed in starting to torch it on the night of April 6th. But by April 7th, they come back around and find that the fires had died out. The Union were stopping them. More fighting ensues. The Union drive off the Confederate cavalry. The Union secure the bridge. So now they're able, this takes a little bit to rebuild the bridge. The Army Corps of Engineers has some fun. They fixed the bridge. And by the end of April 7th, we got the whole forces of Grant moving across the Appomattox River. So that didn't work either. The Appomattox River plan to stop him did not work. April 8th, the Army of North Virginia has reached Appomattox. Lee's goal is to get to Appomattox Station. He's now gotten on a stage road that runs to Lynchburg, Virginia. And his goal is to take that into Appomattox Station, where he's been told again, there's trains of food, it's parked there. This time there actually was. There was actual trains full of food and other supplies parked at Appomattox Station for Lee. The problem is, no sooner that this vanguard of Confederate soldiers get to Appomattox Station, they get their hands on the train, here comes George Armstrong Custer's cavalry over the hill. They're going to drive the Confederate forces through Appomattox Station to high ground north of the village. The Confederates actually have about a good many artillery pieces overlooking Appomattox Station. Union reinforcements arrive. They drive the Confederate artillery off the hill, and this big chunk of the Army of North Virginia's artillery is just dispersed in the countryside, never to return to the Army. Just, somebody ends up going to Lynchburg. And as we get to the night of April 8th, most of the Army of North Virginia are camped in the Appomattox River Valley. They're camped north of the village of Appomattox Courthouse. They can see the fires of what they think is Union cavalry. They think it's just Union cavalry at Appomattox Station to their south. And Lee decides, and at this point, I should mention, Lee and Grant have started a rough communication. Grant has reached out a few times, like, do you really want to surrender? He's trying to send messages across the battle lines, like, I'm willing to talk. And at this point, Lee's like, do I do it? And Longstreet infamously says, not yet. Night of April 8th into the morning of April 9th, Lee tries to plan a breakout out of Appomattox Courthouse. He hopes that he can send Gordon's Corps and, do something pretty similar they did a few weeks back at Fort Stedman. Hopefully this time it actually works. Drive the Union cavalry off the ridges south of Appomattox Courthouse. We reopen our advance to the west, and we keep heading for maybe Lynchburg, and hopefully maybe then we can find a way to get linked down into Danville. But you can see we're really grasping at straws at this point. Morning of April 9th, Gordon being reinforced with Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry is going to line up just on the southwestern outskirts of Appomattox Courthouse. They advance to the ridges, drive these Union skirmishers back. They actually capture some Union artillery pieces. And then right as they start veering to the south, they're actually swinging on with their left flank being the pivot. They're swinging off the stage road, hoping to open. They careened right into the Union 24th Corps and Union 5th Corps. It wasn't cavalry that they were seeing the fires for last night. It was elements of Grant's Union Army group. Most of the Union forces were actually to the east and north of Appomattox, but then you had this force to the southwest, cutting off the stage road to Lynchburg. Really, at this point, Lee's trapped in Appomattox Courthouse. Lee, his officers are going to try to suggest him different strategies. Now, technically, it's not a complete encirclement. He does have an opening going to the northwest out of Appomattox Courthouse that he could go, but where's that going to lead him to? The mountains, the Blue Ridge Mountains? That's it? We're getting closer to Union territory at that point. And actually, it's going to be E.P. it's E.P. Alexander, right? Or E.P. E.P. Alexander, an artillerist. He's going to actually try to convince Lee to go. It basically says, dissolve the army, let it take its guns up into the mountains, and we'll fight them out from there. We'll fight guerrilla war. And Lee immediately shoots down that idea. He's like, no, that's just going to cause more destruction at this point. We're never going to win that. We're not going to win our independence from fighting in the mountains. Yeah, we can hold out for a decade. All we're going to do is just cause more pain and destruction. And it's around that point that Lee makes his decision he's going to surrender. Flag of truce is going to be raised by the Confederates. They're going to ride out. They're going to ride out to the 5th and 24th Corps, send this message to Grant. Grant really doesn't know if this is sincere. Is this really going to happen now? Grant's going to basically write back to Lee, pick a place where we'll meet, let me know when you find it. I'm on my way. Lee is going to eventually settle on the McLean house in the village of Appomattox Courthouse. He doesn't choose to meet in Appomattox Courthouse itself, mostly because that was still technically a Confederate government building. And that wouldn't look too good. So we want to meet on neutral ground. So let's pick this private residence. All right, I'll say the McLean story that's been said over and over. Wilmer McLean owned property near the site of the first battle of Manassas. After the battle, he decided it'd be much safer to relocate to the west of Richmond, away from where he felt the war would get him. Of course, that did not last too long, because by April of 1865, the whole of the Union Confederate armies had come down on his new hometown, and his house ended up being this location of the surrender of the Army of North Virginia. Therefore, Wilmer McLean can tell everybody that the war began in his backyard and ended in his parlor. I also want to add that I was watching a video from the American Battlefield Trust from a park ranger who's at Appomattox Courthouse National Historic Site today, who really does not like the Wilmer McLean story of, don't take too much pity on Wilmer McLean for what he went through, because he was a war profiteer. Wilmer McLean, he thought he was getting a lot of his wealth from building a surplus of sugar that he was getting through the blockade runners for the Confederacy, and then it was just sale for top dollar. Yeah, that didn't really work out too well for him, because Confederate currency was worthless. So, and don't worry, guess what he does after the war? He writes during the Grant administration. The moment Grant gets elected, he's like, hey, remember me? I'm the guy who you ended the wars. You ended the war in my house. It'd be really nice if you gave me a position. And he had, again, like a position, I think, in the Treasury Department or something for the rest of his life. Wilmer McLean did. So don't feel too bad for Wilmer McLean. I mean, bad stuff does happen to the family, but also they did take all the money that was offered to them. So it is what it is. So anyways, back to the story. So Lee goes, he puts on his brand new uniform. He's going to go to the McLean house, and he gets there around 1 o'clock and is going to wait. He does wait reportedly for a little while. Now, people have you believe that's because Grant wanted to make Lee nervous. In reality, it's because Grant doesn't know, is he going to surrender? Or are we going to go back to fighting? He didn't directly say, I have decided I will surrender. It was more of, can we meet to discuss terms of ending hostilities? So Grant's like, he doesn't agree to my terms. I'm opening fire back up. So instead of coming from the north end, he has to ride the whole breadth of his battle line around Appomattox Courthouse, which I think was like some 20 miles or something. He ends up riding that day. It's crazy. So he finally shows up. This is why you have Grant still in his army uniform, his uh his older uniform. He's covered in mud. He goes in and sits down. There are two different tables, and they kind of have this awkward conversation. Lee tries to be the guy that breaks the ice. He's like, we served in Mexico. And Grant's like, yeah. They're both going back and forth. They're trying to break the ice. And then it's eventually, no, my apologies. I think it was Grant who broke the ice, not Lee. Brain not working. Come on, we're getting to the good part. So, Grant and Lee reminisce briefly about their time in Mexico. I think Lee at one point's like, I don't remember your face. He's like, I remember your name. I know I met you. I don't remember what you looked like, honestly. It was like 20 years ago. Don't worry about it to this point. And eventually Lee kind of cuts to the point of, okay, we know why we're really here. And it is he's like, he does want to surrender the Army of Northern Virginia. But he wants to know what terms would Grant offer, which is a little bold to ask. A man whose nickname is Unconditional Surrender Grant, what terms would you offer us after we have fought this war for over 4 years now? We're the biggest thorn in the side of the I don't think it's a big feat in saying the Army of North Virginia was the single biggest thorn in the side of the United States government in the early 1860s. So, Grant, he had already accepted 2 surrenders of Confederate forces before. The first time was in February of 1862 at Fort Donelson. The next time is going to be in July of 1863. He accepts the surrender of Vicksburg, Mississippi. And of course, these were unconditional terms. The third time is going to be April 9th, 1865. And after some going back and forth, this is basically the terms that Grant writes out. Terms of surrender. Headquarters, Armies of the United States, Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, April 9th, 1865. To General Robert E. Lee, Commanding General, Confederate States of America. General, in accordance with the substance of my letter to you of the 8th instant, I propose to receive the surrender of the Army of North Virginia on the following terms. To wit, rolls of all officers and men to be made in duplicate. One copy to be given to an officer to be designated to me, the other to be retained by such officer or officers as you designate. The officers to give them individual paroles not to take up arms against the government of the United States until properly exchanged. And each company or regimental commander to sign a like parole for the men of their commands. The armies, artillery, and public property to be parked and stacked and turned over to the officers appointed to me to receive them. This will not embrace the sidearms of the officers, nor their private horses or baggage. This done, officers and men will be allowed to return to their homes, not to be disturbed by the United States authority, as long as they observe their parole and the laws in force where they may reside. Very respectfully, Ulysses S. Grant. Lee will make I forget which word it is. He does change one word. He does request Grant to change like one word. And he will also request for Grants, like you mentioned about the horses for officers. Well, a lot of the men own horses as well. And can they keep their horses when they go home? Because they need to get home. It's their property. They need to get home. And Grant's like, I'm not going to change the terms. Like, I'm not going to change it in ink, but you have my honor that I'm going to let you do that. I'm going to tell all my officers, hey, soldier has proof that this is their horse. Let him keep it. And with that, they're going to bring their respective staffs in. Grant will introduce Lee to all the staff officers. There's amongst I forget every man that's in the room. Robert Lincoln's one son, he's in the room. He was made a staff officer for this moment. The other famous one's Eli Parker, who is actually a Native American. And there's interesting exchange where Robert E. Lee says to Parker, I'm glad to see at least we have one true American in the room, to which Eli Parker says, sir, we're all Americans here today. You can tell too that like Grant again really did not believe this was going to happen on this day in such a peaceful way. He wanted it to happen this way, just didn't believe it. So when they're writing down these terms of stuff, they're out, Lee, and Grant both going, anybody got a paper? Does anybody got ink? So like these staff officers are just like going to hand all this stuff or go forge around the house for all this, all the stationary stuff to make this all happen. So, it really shows just like it's kind of just materialized. Nobody expected to wake up April 9th and this was going to be the day that at least the Army of North Virginia was going to come to the end. Hey, these guys always love talking about the Mexican-American War. I mean, we talk about the war between brother and brother. This perfect example is why. Man, these officers had served alongside each other. You hear countless examples of that. So, terms are signed. Lee agrees to them. Lee leaves McLean House. There's gentleman's salute by Grant and his staff officers. Lee returns, rides on Traveler back for Appomattox Courthouse over to the Army of North Virginia, and soldiers are surrounding him and basically putting the words in his mouth of what just happened. He's trying to explain, and then he doesn't really have like some big bad speech or anything. There's nothing like that. It's more Lee kind of tells his men, you've made great soldiers. I entrust you also make great citizens. And that is essentially the end of Robert E. Lee's military career. Obviously he'll hang around a little bit longer, but outside that, he rides off, goes back home, goes back to Richmond, and that's really the end of Lee in the American Civil War. He's basically a private civilian for the rest of his days. He'll live until 1870. Of course, there's much work still to be done. We're not done quite yet. So we heard about them paroles. Almost immediately after the surrenders are signed and the word spreads out to both sides. And I should also mention when Grant goes back and, everybody in the Union ranks hear what happened, that, it's surrendered, and in their minds, by all intents and purposes, the war is over. By God, it's finally over. There's free cheers. Muskets are being fired from the southern ridge of the southern ridges around Appomattox. By the time Lee gets up there, by the time he gets up to the ridge, he basically calls off everybody. No humiliation, no celebrations. We've already done our job. Now they are citizens with us again. We just go about making sure everybody gets home safely. Did I get to visit Lee's grave? I did not. I know I was in Lexington. I know I walked around the cemetery Jackson's buried in, but I believe he's buried. Lee's buried at like Lee and Washington University, if I'm not mistaken. So I didn't actually get to go there. I didn't have time to go off. I probably should on a return visit, because yes, he is buried in Lexington. Yeah, he's buried at Washington Lee. I didn't have time to actually go to the University Chapel where he's buried. I really want to go back down to the Shenandoah Valley. It may even happen this year. I'm gonna see how. I got different ideas. We're mainly focusing for the first half of the year. I'm going to be doing a lot of trips focused on the Battle of Lake Erie and more the Lake Erie campaign of 1813, because I want to talk about the War of 1812 so badly. And actually, this weekend is actually my first trip to really focus on War of 1812 stuff. And we'll be talking about other things while I'm up there. I just don't. When I go on my trips, we call them Blitz for a reason, because we're doing a bunch of different stuff in different time periods to get as much content made. I've thought about maybe going to Baltimore later in the year, so we could talk about the Battle of Baltimore, and I'd love to go see the historic ships of Baltimore. There's a lot of stuff there. But if that doesn't work out, I'm all for going to Shenandoah. Actually, wouldn't technically going to Shenandoah would be farther, I guess. Yeah. I'd like to go back to the Shenandoah Valley and do a lot more there. There's so many battlefields, so many important stuff. I'd love to go back to, I'd love to just go back to Newmarket. Like, I was only there for like 2 hours. So I'd love to go back and see other parts of the battlefield that have nothing to do with the VMI cadets. So if I go back to the Shenandoah Valley, I'm definitely going back to Lexington, and I will definitely make a video about Lee's grave there. So it's on the bucket list. And you've been there. Oh, I envy you. I need a car that doesn't have the rust. I need a car that doesn't have the underside destroyed by PennDOT. Okay, that's what I need. That's what I need to do all this stuff. But so they need these paroles, is what I was getting to initially. And basically, almost immediately across the street from the McLean house in this tavern, they set up this basically impromptu printing shop. And they just start printing out all of these parole passes for soldiers of the Army of Northern Virginia. And those paroles are so important. They're some of the most important pieces of paper ever printed during the American Civil War, because that basically entitles these soldiers that they can get rations from the United States Army, that they can board trains just like a U.S. soldier would board a train. They're allowed to board trains. They're really allowed to do anything that involves getting them back home. As long as they have that parole pass, they're really allowed to do anything that is required of them to get back home. So that is very important. And a lot of these parole passes do still survive to this day. Several of them were preserved and passed down as family heirlooms because of how important they were. So all that's being made. And really, you also have a day where the artillery is going to surrender. All the artillery surrendered over to the Union. All these surrenders keep going on. There's they're there for a little while because, immediately after the surrenders are signed, Grant promises Lee, like, I'm sending rations over to your guys as soon as possible. Because as we mentioned, the Army of North Virginia is starving at this point. So all these rations are being sent over. I don't think it's until like April 11th that the main infantry surrender finally occurs, or it's like April 12th or something like that. And when it's either April 11th and 12th, where you have like the soldiers actually marching and going and stacking arms, turning over their flags in front of the Union Army. That's not Grant and Lee are not at the actual surrender of the infantry. That is overseen for the Confederates by John B. Gordon and by the Union by Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who by that point had become a general in the 5th Corps. So, yeah, that interaction there. And like I said, that's really the end of the Army of North Virginia. The Army of North Virginia, one of the most storied, and we have all this debate, and especially nowadays with people going back and forth with interpreting history, why are we revering an army that rebelled against our own country? You have all that stuff. And, actually there's a lot of good, it's a good question to ask why we do that. And it comes down to just, a lot of these guys, they were born American citizens. A lot of them served in the American Army before and after the war. And a lot of their tactics, particularly around 1862 and 1863, really forced the, United States Army to rethink how they operated. U.S. Army, well, all militaries have this lot of thing of, they fight enemies, but then they also have great reverence for certain enemies, respect. This is the final, the American Civil War is the twilight age of that gentleman warfare, where there's like these certain unspoken rules that you don't do in war and stuff, which were actually broken during the Civil War. We would never hear that today. So the Army of North Virginia does deserve its place in history, does deserve to be studied. It did lose at the end of the day. Keep that in mind. And I think there's only so much great leadership can do with a crappy logistics network. But in any case, the storied Army of North Virginia was no more after April 9th, 1865, living on in only name only. Contrary to popular belief, Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse is not the end of the American Civil War. Lee did not just surrender the entire Confederate government over right then and there. He didn't have the authority to do that. But what it does do, it sets the blueprint on how all future surrenders are going to be held, and really kind of sets the tempo for how it was hoped the United States government would handle Reconstruction. Unfortunately, that's not how it handled it, and we all know that Reconstruction really did not go well. Was highly corrupt, did not get the support it needed, and really we end up with your Jim Crow laws. You end up returning to some sort of status quo in some ways in the Deep South. It just, say hello to the new boss, same as your old boss. But it's the ideal that's worth really reflecting upon Appomattox Courthouse for, that ideal that we can live up to this as American citizens. This is the standard we should live up to. What people like Grant and Lee were hopeful for on April 9th, 1865, that for all of our all our differences, all the horrible things we can do each other when we're fighting over a disagreement. That at the end of the day, we can come together and be humans. And, we can still treat each other with some respect and dignity once we're done fighting. So that's what the Appomattox Courthouse means to the United States history. Now, as for the American Civil War, we'll get to him one day. And of course, April 9th, 1865 happens. Everybody's jubilant. The Army of North Virginia surrendered. The leading fighting force for the Confederacy has been defeated. Everybody knows that point. It's only a matter of time for everybody else to surrender and for the Confederacy to completely implode. And then all that enthusiasm goes out the window less than a week later when, morning of April 15th, everybody's waking up and getting reports that President Lincoln has been shot and killed the night before. And then we go into the Johnson administration, as outright history alluded to, and boy, is it a mess. Again, stream for another night. Also, another miscommunication. The surrender at Appomattox is not the largest surrender of Confederate troops during the Civil War. Nope. I mentioned at the start of the, I don't know the exact number when this whole campaign begins, but let's say about 50 to 55,000 men is what the Army of North Virginia had. At the actual surrender, it was only about 20 to 25,000 men, if that. It was probably more like 20,000 men, which just really shows you how quickly the Army deteriorated in those few weeks. Like it just, the straw that broke the camel's back was Five Forks, and it just all imploded from there. The largest surrender is actually at Bennett's Place, although it isn't like an Appomattox. So like Appomattox is really interesting because you have the village, and then like a mile on one side it's the Confederate Army, and a mile on the other is the Union Army. Everybody's in such close proximity. Bennett's Place in North Carolina is a bit of a different situation. Bennett's Place was the meeting place for Sherman and Joe Johnston, the Confederate commander of the Army of Tennessee, which I don't know if you heard my joke earlier. I was like, yeah, the Army of Tennessee in 1865 is going to see Journey, but without Steve Perry in the lead. Fight me. So Johnston and Sherman are going to meet at this place known as Bennett's Place and discuss the terms. And initially Sherman gives like overly generous, like beyond what the Appomattox terms were. They were talking basically like keeping property, like, like slave property. It was a little more ambiguous than that, but like, it was like, yeah, he was being a little too generous with the Confederates. Like, yeah, you keep everything. It's going to be great. And like Johnson and Sherman really have like good, like they were having a great conversation where Grant and Lee was a little more awkward. Johnson and Sherman were like, this is great. We're like meeting together. I'm going back to Ben's place. I'm going to meet with Sherman. Everybody else looks like, what's going on? These guys are riding off 20 miles away to go hang out and talk about this like utopia. They're like, this is going to be perfect. Everybody's going to own all, everything's going back to status quo and everybody's going to get along to be great. Drink more. And then eventually Grant came down and put the hammer on Sherman's like, no. These are the terms I gave to Lee. You would give it to Johnston. And that basically the terms that we just I read earlier is basically what's given at Bennett's Place as well. Bennett's Place, I'd love to do its own stream for, but I'm just not going to have time. I really wanted to do one. Yes, how Johnson dies. So are we talking about Joe Johnston or we're talking about Joe Johnson, right? Yeah, Joe Johnson. Joe Johnston and Sherman began a very close friendship because of their interactions at Bennett's Place in their surrenders. So they got along, regular correspondence. And when Sherman dies, Joe Johnston was a pallbearer for Sherman's funeral. It was a very cold day when that funeral happened. So Johnston, he refused to dress for he was going to stay, in his pallbearer dress. He wasn't going to go and put heavy layers on. And then he caught, was it pneumonia he caught, or was it influenza? He catches an illness and he dies a few weeks later. So Johnson died in part because he was a pallbearer at Sherman's funeral. That's the story, right? It is a really good, it is one of them, like how poetic type deal. Johnson surrendered to Sherman, but Johnson ends up dying because he was literally carrying Sherman to his final grave. And it still isn't the last surrender of the Civil War. Friggin' in April, you have the Sultana explosion, which everybody forgets about happens in April. Big explosion. So, after everybody's been paroled, all these soldiers going home, going up the Mississippi River. And the Sultana was this, was this steam powered paddle boat on the Mississippi River. And they had like almost like 2,000 people on this paddle boat. It was overcrowded. A lot of them are just soldiers, former Confederates and Union soldiers. It was both Union and Confederate soldiers been released from like respective prisoner camps going home. Boilers exploded, killed more people than the actual sinking of the Titanic killed. Like it is crazy, the Sultana. And everybody forgets about it because of how crazy April 1865 is. So think about that. April of 1865, the United States. You have the surrender of the Army of North Virginia. You have the surrender of the Army of Tennessee. You have the assassination of President Lincoln. You have the worst maritime accident in American history. Sorry. You just all this happened. The burning of Richmond we already talked about. You have all this stuff just happens at once. And it's crazy what happened in this 1 month. The last notable surrender for Confederates was the CSS Shenandoah. That won't be until this. Is it the Shenandoah? Yeah, it's the Shenandoah, right? Yeah, that's the blockade runner that was like way out there. It was like, let me check. Huh. Maiden voyage, 1863. Transport troops in New Zealand and return. What? I gotta do research. Sorry, I'm finding stuff out. Anyways, the CSS Shenandoah, it was like a private, I think it was like a privateer. It went out there and it said to fire the last shots of the Civil War, off the Alaskan coast. Like it didn't surrender until December of like, no, it was November of 1865, like a pool in the port in Liverpool. And they're like, here we go. Of our latest catch. And the British executives are like, that the war ended in April. What? So it wasn't like they were fighting to the end. It was more we went out on tour and we didn't get word for several months that this happened. Okay, we surrender. So that's like, it was November 1865. That's like the last notable surrender is the CSS Shenandoah. I really want to go to Appomattox Courthouse. I've seen many videos from people like Project Pass. I actually shared Project Pass video about the last Confederate assault at Appomattox Courthouse yesterday on Twitter. I've seen so many people go there. It just seems like a cool historic site just because it's like all there. The whole village is preserved, or they've tried to return it to its 1865 appearance. So I actually contemplated last year when we were down in Bedford, Virginia, about going to Appomattox. I was thinking like, well, on our way out, maybe we'll cut through Lynchburg and Appomattox Courthouse and, head out that way. Yeah, but we decided instead to go back up the Shenandoah Valley. And that's how I got the Newmarket video. So it's on the bucket list. Definitely going to want to go see Appomattox Courthouse, where Robert E. Lee's military career ended and he surrendered the Army of North Virginia. And with that, I think we're going to wrap up tonight's stream because I'm getting very tired. I hope you all enjoyed my rambling and my confusion powered by Coors Banquet. I hope I'd say about 60. Wait, was it 66% was historically accurate? It's just less than 2/3, Will I be doing more live streams? I do hope to do more. Like I said, I like doing live streams when I have like a historical event to talk about. I was there for a while just doing like weekly. I like doing the preservation shout outs, but after a little while, it was getting a little, I don't want to say I was running out of like historical preservation groups to talk about because there are so many to talk about. But it was getting to a point after every week, I was like, okay, what do I talk about this week? Oh boy. So that, yeah, I guess I just kind of got burned out from doing that weekly. So I really much prefer doing this when we do a live stream and I want to commemorate a historical event as close to the anniversary. I'm hoping to do an uncut history for the battles of Lexington and Concord because April 19th, this month, will be the 250th anniversary of the commencement of the American Revolution. And I don't want to miss commemorating that. I'm not able to go visit. but I'd like to do a live stream for it. So I think if all else fails, you could expect me around April 19th. And I think it's a Saturday. Oh, it's a Saturday. Yeah, next week's a Saturday. Okay. Oh, that's next week. Oh, I don't know if I've. Can I squeeze that between underwater basket weaving and work? I don't know if I could. Well, we're gonna do something. We'll do something next Saturday or Sunday or something about Lex and Concord. You know, yeah, the Mayor Bethel Trust been doing a great series about the whole campaign. I mean, they started with City Points and then they kind of walked their way through the breakthrough at Five Forks, and then they've been following in the footsteps of the Appomattox campaign right up to Appomattox Courthouse. I don't think they release. I didn't see one released this evening before I went live. I want to see. They didn't do another one, did they? No, they only have a. Actually, before we leave tonight, let me give you a link to the experts. Let me give you a link to the people that know what they're actually talking about, not the schmuck here dressed in union wool with, Pomni the jester clown back there. Oh yeah, she's ready for her next exciting trip. Pomni, are you ready to build an entire fleet in the wilderness? Yeah, it's not as effective, when I don't do the shaky cam. I can't really do the shaky cam without editing. So yeah, let me drop a link to the American Battlefield Trust playlist for their Appomattox campaign coverage. It has been phenomenal. It's been some actually their best work, in my opinion. Just so many cool stuff. Love the Sailor Creek video. History of Waffles also I think he's doing a multi-part series about Appomattox as well. I know he did a part one and was like, I watched the whole thing. He did a lot about Sailor's Creek. So let me get his link as well. So you can go and watch episode 1 of his Appomattox road trip to commemorate the 160th anniversary of this campaign and of this very important moment in American history. History with Waffles. He is definitely one of the historians to ever historian. That's what I'll say. Gary Edelman's one of the historians to ever historian. Well, guys, with that said, thank you all for watching. Before you do the part, consider heading to Readout Productions Replay. Yes, head to Readout Productions Replay, because that is where I catalog all of the live streams we do. Because YouTube, for whatever reason, does not like your channel currently live streaming and producing videos at the same time. It's either you make videos or you live stream. You can't do both. So if I want to grow this channel so we can edumaricate more people, I need to keep the live streams on a separate channel. So I'm going to drop the link in the chat right now. So if you've not subscribed, consider heading over. That's the best way to support this stream. And then the replay should be uploaded probably around tomorrow. If you want to hit the like button, then I'd appreciate it. And if this is the first time you're tuned in live, you've have no idea what Readout Production is, welcome. Hopefully I haven't scared you of my insanity. We live, explore, and preserve history one video at a time. And we have a new video coming out this Friday. It'll be about John C. Ewing. He was part of the 211th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. Though he didn't see a lot of action, he didn't get involved in the war to the tail end. He would be involved in the repulsing of the Confederate attack at Fort Stedman. And he was involved with the breakthrough at Petersburg, where his actions would ultimately award him a Medal of Honor. So we'll be talking about him this Friday on the latest edition of Laurel Highlands Heroes. And Retracing History should be returning real soon. I'm planning this weekend to head up north, film a lot of content, make a bunch of videos from it. So thank you guys for watching. We'll see you next time.
Farewell and adieu to you fair Spanish ladies. Farewell and adieu, you ladies of Spain.